You're listening to the Critical Hour on Radio Sputnik. I'm Wilmer Leon, joined here by my co-host, Garland Nixon.
Thank you, Wilmer.
Chris Hedges has a piece in Consortium News entitled, "Stop Pretending U.S. is a Functioning Democracy." Chris Hedges writes, "There are no institutions, including the press, an electoral system, the imperial presidency, the courts, or the penal system, that can be defined as democratic. Only the fiction of democracy remains." For insight into this, let's turn to our next guest. He holds the John J. and Rebecca Moore's Chair of History and African American Studies at the University of Houston. He's one of the most prolific writers of our time. His latest book is entitled The Counter-Revolution of 1836, Texas Slavery, Jim Crow, and the Roots of American Fascism. Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, sir, welcome back.
Thank you for inviting me.
So, Chris Hedges writes, there's a fatal disconnect between a political system that promises democratic equality and freedom while carrying out socioeconomic injustices that result in grotesque income inequality and political stagnation. Dr. Horne, there is a disconnect between what has been and continues to be promised versus what has been and continues to be delivered. In fact, one can posit that the founding documents were never truly democratic to begin with. Your thoughts, Dr. Gerald Horne?
Well, obviously, your latter point is accurate. You need look no further than the antiquated Electoral College, which too often has allowed the person who gets the fewest number of votes, popular votes, for the White House to prevail. And look no further than the 2016 election of one Donald J. Trump, although he received 3 million fewer votes than his Democratic counterpart. Look no further than the U.S. Senate, which gives 2 seats to Wyoming, whose population is probably not larger than that of the District of Columbia, which of course has no U.S. Senate seats, and gives 2 Senate seats to California, which has a population reaching 40 million plus. So obviously, Christopher Hedges has a point, but the danger now, I'm afraid to report, per a piece in the New York Times in the last 24 to 48 hours by their journalist Carl Hulse, Hulse, is that the right wing is contemplating a constitutional convention. That is to say, this vaunted and sainted 18th century Constitution, which has been defended by so many as the last word in terms of constitutions, the right wing has decided that it's insufficient. So buckle your seatbelts, because if this constitutional convention takes place, I'm afraid to tell your audience, do not be surprised if there's an overthrow of the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery, for example. There is growing concern in Republican Party ranks about the constitutional amendment approximately a century ago that gave women the right to vote in light of the Dobbs decision, further circumscribing women's reproductive freedom in the United States, which apparently has led to a surge in women registering to vote, particularly against Republicans. See the referendum on the right to choice in Kansas just a few weeks ago. So do not be surprised if there are either restrictions or overthrowing of women's suffrage. So I'm afraid to say that our lone national nightmare is far from being over.
Dr. Horne, it's interesting you said that, because a while back, for several months ago, I was talking about if the conservatives get enough power, they'll have a constitutional convention. But I think you have to look at that through the lens of how that happened, in that when the Biden administration comes in, they make a bunch of promises, so they know what people want. They know, I know what you want. Boom, I'm promising all of it. but it's wholly neoliberal, neoconservative. So that was just a ruse to get the suckers to vote for him. And then all promises were abandoned. So you have a party, you have the conservatives who have all these terrible things they want to do with the Constitution. But there's a lot of countries that have parties that want to do all kinds of things like that. But then you have a Democratic Party that has completely abandoned the working class. And black people forget it, but that's over. They're thrown right off the bus right the day after the vote. And so you create a dysfunctional dynamic where these kinds of things are almost guaranteed to happen in a dynamic this dysfunctional. Your thoughts, Dr. Horne?
Well, the only footnote I would add is that I grant agency to the 74, 75 million, mostly Euro-American, significantly working class and middle class who voted for Mr. Trump in 2020. I'm not of the opinion that necessarily they voted for Mr. Trump because they saw Mr. Trump as providing more opportunity than the Democrats. For example, if you go back to 1991, when 55% of the Euro-American population in the state of Louisiana voted for a Nazi and a Klansman, David Duke, for governor, I doubt if they cast their vote for David Duke because they saw the Democrats as being neoliberal. I think that we have to give some agency to those who are pushing from below, pushing the country to the right, and that's what makes this idea of the Constitutional Convention all the more dangerous, particularly dangerous, I'm afraid to say, for those who have been in the bullseye ever since this country came together in the 18th century, speaking of the black population, which did not engage in class collaboration when British rule was overthrown in the 18th century to establish the United States. That is to say, they did not stand beside slave owners. And of course, by 1865, the billions of dollars in investment in these Negroes was taken by the government without compensation, which has infuriated Dixiecrats to this very day since they lost money on that particular enterprise. And so the situation, I'm afraid to say, is ever more dire. And so if folks are looking for a way out, I'm giving a major address this coming Sunday proposing that the international community needs to get much more involved in U.S. domestic affairs. Because if the United States, as those on high have told us, is actually tipping towards fascism, this will not just be a danger for the people of the United States, not just for the black people of the United States, it would be a danger for the entire international community. And so therefore, the international community has a right to get involved in what might befall them. And so I think that's the way out. But unfortunately and sadly, that simple thought apparently has not crossed the minds of many of our leaders and many of our organizations who are still operating as if the year was 1954.
The collective self-delusion masks what America has become, a nation where the citizenry has been stripped of economic and political power and where brutal militarism practiced overseas is practiced at home. In classical totalitarian regimes such as Nazi Germany or Stalin's Soviet Union, economics was subordinate to politics, but under inverted totalitarianism, the reverse is true. And let me ask you, Dr. Horne, I think when you inject neoliberalism into that analysis, whether we're looking at Chile or whether we're looking at Argentina or whether we're looking at the Soviet Union under Boris Yeltsin and the damage that economics does, that's exactly where America is and exactly where America is headed.
Well, that's a fair point, and I take it from Chris Hedges' comment and yours that you're drawing a connection between the global and the domestic. Mm-hmm. That is to say that it is not tenable for the United States to support a fascist coup in Chile on September 11th, 1973, and help to destabilize a left-leaning government in Afghanistan in order to install religious zealots, as happened in the aftermath of the Soviet intervention in Kabul in 1979. I could go on with this litany, but at a certain point, what happens abroad inevitably comes back home. And that, of course, brings us to the crisis of the day, which is to say the crisis in Central and Eastern Europe, whereby you would not know, if you were just a casual observer, if the United States and its allies were sanctioning Moscow or sanctioning themselves. But what's even more remarkable with regard to that state of affairs is that the United States has stacked the deck in its favor, and the Europeans, being chumps extraordinaire, have gone along with it. And what I mean is, the United States is not sanctioning the import of Russian is sanctioning the import of Russian oil, but it only gets 3%. But it compels the Europeans to sanction the import. The United States is not sanctioning the import of Russian uranium because it gets 15%, and the other supplies are in Southern Africa, and those nations are not considered to be reliable. The Europeans go along with that as well. But it seems to me that the last word may be held by the European populace. And if you saw the demonstrations in Prague just a few days ago, tens of thousands marching against the boneheaded policies of their government, I think that that's just a foretaste of what you will probably see in London, Paris, and Berlin sooner rather than later. And the repercussions inevitably will be coming back across the Atlantic. And that's why, of course, I'm making this address on Sunday that I've already suggested.
And Dr. Horne, what we're looking at now is the prices of commodities are up. The Middle Eastern countries, the oil countries are making a fortune. The Russians are making a fortune. The U.S. making a whole lot of money off of this. The EU, the chumps as they are getting absolutely cleaned out. But even to put an asterisk on Chris Hedges' argument that this is not a functioning democracy, for all of the profit that's coming to the U.S., it's only going to the oligarchs. The people, everything's still falling for the American people as the wealthy, the oil companies, et cetera, are making a fortune, LNG, et cetera, are making so much more money going to selling to the Europeans. Dr. Horne.
And of course, liquefied natural gas from the United States is 40% more expensive than its counterpart from Russia, minimally. And I'm sure you've covered this, but let me put my 2 cents on this recent proposal from the U.S. Treasury Department to seek to put a cap on Russian energy exports to deprive Russia of revenue. Point number one, Russia has made clear that those who go down that path should expect not to get any energy from Russia. But in any case, what your alert listeners need to realize is that that proposal is kind of a backdoor to undermine and destabilize OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries. That is to say that ever since the 1970s, when you had the so-called oil crisis, the North Atlantic countries have been seeking to take back the opportunity to establish oil prices to their benefit and to the detriment of the Saudis, the Nigerians, the Angolans, the Algerians, et cetera. And given this proposal to put a cap on Russian energy, in some ways that's saying put a cap on energy generally, but I don't think that that'll fly, and it'll particularly be discussed, I'm sure, in the next few days when President Xi Jinping of China meets with his Russian counterpart in Uzbekistan for the annual meeting of the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, a direct counterpart to the U.S.-dominated NATO, and then we are told flies on to Saudi Arabia, where I'm sure this issue I just outlined will be foremost in discussion.
For those who want to tune in to the presentation you're going to make on Sunday, how do they do it and where do they do it?
Just Google my name, put my name in a search engine. An international conference, September 11th, 2022. My address is 11:10 a.m. Central, 12:10 Eastern.
Dr. Gerald Horne, as always, thank you so much for your time. We greatly, greatly appreciate that analysis, and we look forward to having you back.
Thank you.